Hello, good evening everyone. This is Dari on World Streams Radio. Thank you to our listeners from all around the world for joining us. To learn more about World Streams Radio, visit our website, worldstreams.org. You can also find us now on Facebook at facebook.com/worldstreams and facebook.com/worldstreams.worldmusic. Our guest tonight is John Tirman. John Tirman is author of several books on global affairs and is currently executive director of MIT's Center for International Studies, where he is also principal research scientist. His books include 100 Ways America is Screwing Up the World, Spoils of War, The Human Cost of America's Arms Trade, Making Money Sing, Private Wealth and the Public Power in the Search for Peace, and his newest book, The Death of Others, The Fate of Civilians in American Wars, which we'll be discussing this evening. Hello, Saeed. Hello and welcome, John. It's a pleasure to have you back with us on World Streams tonight.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Dari, for this lovely introduction, and thank you to our listeners. Good evening to everybody, all our listeners from around the world, and thank you, John, for being with us. Let's start with this question here. What compelled you to write about such aspect of war that is definitely, clearly not very well known to people? Was it this aspect?
Yeah, so I was interested in the civilian casualties during the first phases of the Iraq War. I noticed that civilians, what was happening to Iraqis themselves, was not being mentioned much in the news media. And so I started to pay attention to this with some care, and I was particularly taken in 2004 when the first household survey of Iraq mortality, how many people had died in the war, was published in the British medical journal, The Lancet. And the authors of that article, the scientists who conducted the survey, Les Roberts and Gilbert Burnham, mainly at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, a very high-ranking scientific institution, were getting virtually no attention in discussing their findings, which was that 100,000 people had died in Iraq in the first, I believe it was 19 months of the war that began in 2003. And so I was puzzled by this response, that there were so few people that were paying attention to this, growing humanitarian catastrophe. We were also hearing about large numbers of refugees and displaced people and so on. So I began to look at this rather closely, and I had Les Roberts come to MIT to speak and write something for us, and I also began to write about a little bit op-eds and that sort of thing. And then I decided to write a book, and my editor at the Oxford University Press, which bought and published the book, wanted me to also talk about other wars. So I went back and did a lot of research on the Korean War and the Vietnam War to see how we viewed civilians during those wars, what our policies were towards civilians, and then, of course, what the American public reaction has been toward these very high mortality figures.
So what were some of the challenges you ran into in trying to very much compile a very good picture and give it to your readers?
Well, there were two things I would point out. I mean, of course, there's a lot of historical material which I try to distill down to focus on this matter of what happens to ordinary people in these war zones. But I also had a couple of other hurdles to get over. One was I wanted to be able to represent the people from those countries during the war. That is, I wanted to have their voices prominent in the book. And it was very difficult to find, in fact, in English. I don't speak Korean or Vietnamese or Arabic, so I'm limited in that way. But it was very striking to me, and remains so, that we have very few representations of people who suffered these wars in Korea, in Vietnam, in Iraq, and, of course, also Afghanistan. So that was one major thing, was sort of trying to figure out what was happening to them, and what their view of it was. And the second major thing, which is what attracted me to it initially, was this controversy over mortality, about how many people died, and how many people were made refugees, and how many people were, sort of immiserated, made poor, or made widows, or what have you. And of course, there are guesses. There are lots of estimates. But the estimates I found, especially for Korea and Vietnam, were really just guesses. Guesses based on one thing or another, but not systematic knowledge. In Iraq, we have a little bit more systematic knowledge, mainly thanks to the household surveys that have been done, but it's still a very wide open question. And, I think this is not only a challenge to a researcher like myself, but it's a moral abomination that we don't know, in fact, how many people are dying in the wars that we start.
Okay, and there is another dilemma that could add to that, is the representation of the media of how many between the highest numbers and the lowest numbers. And why is it that it's always good to tell the lowest number? Is there a moral dimension to that, or is it a political dimension, or is it both?
Well, I'm struck, I must say, by even now, 8 years after the beginning of the Iraq War, almost 8.5, we have reporters and editors in the major news media routinely saying that there are 10,000 people, tens of thousands of people who have died in Iraq. We know that there are hundreds of thousands of people who have died in Iraq. It's just insulting to say that there are tens of thousands, and yet, in fact, there was an article in the New York Times, I think, yesterday. It was usually about something else. This was about the new violence that had hit Iraq the day before. But we've seen this in the Boston Globe. We've seen it on CNN. We've seen it on NPR. It's just amazing how the mainstream, even the slightly liberal news media in this country, default to this number of tens of thousands. And I think that this is both a moral flaw and also a strategic blunder, if you will. That is, that if we are constantly referring to the human cost of the Iraq War as in the tens of thousands, then one could easily say that it was worth it to knock off Saddam Hussein, right?
Right.
And in fact, that's what a lot of people on the right wing are saying. That it's unfortunate that this many people died, but in fact, he was such a monster that it was worth it to get rid of him. So, my objection to this, my interest in it, is both a moral one, why we can't come to terms with it, but also one that has consequences when you use the lowest possible numbers.